Hi everybody, how are you? I hope you are fine. So, my dear students, you can see here your science book and I'm going to present lesson number 3. And today's lecture is about separating mixtures. Okay, but before going towards our main contents, let's recall the previous lesson in which we have discussed about the molecules and compounds, their differences, and we have talked about the mixtures and their uses, and finally we have talked about the uses of compounds. So here are some points that we will discuss in our today's lesson, that is about the separation techniques, which include filtration, evaporation, sublimation, and finally paper chromatography. So these are some of the separation. Wow, here's a warm-up activity. So just imagine that you have to produce a painting urgently for your friend's birthday, and you only have three colors of paint, like red, yellow, and blue. How can you produce the other colors like green and orange? Hmm. Take your time. Well, that's true. We will simply mix the colors, but we will mix the colors in fixed proportion. Like if we want to make a green color, we need to mix yellow and blue. If we want to make orange color out of the available paints, we need to mix yellow paint with a red paint. I hope you find it quite interesting. So here we come about the techniques to separate different mixtures. So the first technique is filtration. Well, it is very important phenomena because in which we can separate insoluble solid particles from the solvent. And for this purpose, we will use a filter media. Now the question is, what is a filter media? Filter media is basically a filter paper, okay, which has different sizes depending upon their pore size. So if we have a mixture of liquid and solid that is not dissolved, there are some suspended particles in this mixture, then we can separate the liquid by filtering. It can be used to separate sand and water or chalk because these are insoluble in water. Like if we want to separate the salt and water, it's impossible, but we can done the separation of salt and water from other technique that we will learn later. So the large particles that is left on the filter paper after the process of filtering is called a residue, and the smaller particles of liquid that passes through and are collected, they are filtrate. So here is a picture or a diagram showing the process of filtration. So in order to do a filtration, you need to have a filter paper, a funnel, conical flask, and a beaker which contains a mixture of liquid with some suspended particles that we need to separate. Okay, so what you need to do, you just need to pour this mixture that contains liquid along with some suspended particles, and when we pour it onto the filter paper, the particles that are the particle is just like a sieve. Okay, so during filtering, the mixture is poured into a filter paper that is held in a funnel, and the filter paper is full of tiny holes and acts like a sieve. I have just told you that the filter paper is of different types and they have different Wattman number, which depends on upon the size of their pores. So the large particles of the solids are too large to go through the tiny holes and are left in the filter paper as a residue. So the material that is left over here is called a residue, which is a suspended particles that was in our mixture. And the smaller particles of the liquid that passes through, and they are collected as the filtrate here, and this is what we get, filtrate. So in this way, the insoluble solid and the liquid are separated. So it can be used to separate sand and water. As I've told you earlier, they are used to separate different. If we take examples in our daily life, like filtering coffee by using a strainer, we use a tea bag that already contains a casing around it, which contains a very small pore size, which doesn't allow the tea leaves to come outside, but they only allow very liquid to pass to overflow the tea bag and just get the taste of tea leaves. And similarly, we can see the grades of over the drinks that we use to filter, or we use to protect unwanted materials to get inside the drinks. And if we're talking about a hair nose, hairs in our nose, which filter out the dust particles from the air we breathe in. So these are some of the very common examples we observe in our daily life. If we talk about the car and the vacuum cleaner, so cars are, they have some filter, filter, that is a oil filter or a air filter, to prevent dust and other unwanted particles getting into and damaging the engine. Similarly, vacuum cleaners, they are fitted with a cloth filter. Have you ever observed when you do a vacuum cleaner, and after done with it, when we are cleaning or separating the parts just to take out the dust, there is some small cloth filter bag, so that the dust they pick up is not circulated in the air, and they just get together in this bag. So people, they are using vacuum cleaners. They can easily observe at your home as well if you want to see the filter paper in it. Similarly, the people that is using sanding and grinding machines, they wear face masks. And why their face masks? To filter out the dust from the air they breathe in. Okay, so there is compulsory to wear masks when you are doing work at some places where there is you know there is the necessary to wear. So on a large scale, when we talk about water treatment, the water treatment works. So water is filtered through sand layers of sand and gravel. Okay, so why it's so? Because to clean it before it undergoes further treatment to make it fit to the drink. Here you can see the layers of sand and gravel, and finally then it does a slow sand filtration. It's basically a slow sand filtration. So at a water treatment works, the water is filtered through the layers of sand and gravel to remove the dirt out of it. Now let's jump in into another technique, that is evaporation. So as we have just discussed earlier, that we cannot separate a dissolved solid such as salt from a liquid such as water by filtration. But yes, you can separate the salt by evaporation. The solution that containing the dissolved salt is called a solute. So solute are in lesser amount. So the dissolved salt are solute and the liquid is called a solvent. So here you can see a whole apparatus that is used for the process of evaporation. Here you can see a Bunsen burner just to provide heat, a tripod stand on which we place a evaporating dish, a wire gauze, and now let me tell you their purpose. As I've told you that Bunsen burner is here just to provide heat, tripod stand to place this evaporating dish, and this evaporating dish is a circular piece of glass or porcelain, and that is used to evaporate liquid. And do you know, it is used to evaporate the excess solvent, most of commonly water, to produce a very concentrated solution or a solid precipitate of the dissolved salt. Like in this case, if we pour a mixture of water and salt, and then we provide heat, then after evaporating excess liquid, we will get only a concentrated solid or a precipitate of salt here, and That's how the evaporation helps in the separation of solid particles from the liquid solvent. And let me tell you about the function of wire gauze. So wire gauze basically it's for the heat resistant. It's a heat resistant and it protects a beaker or a china dish or whatever you are placing here from breaking down. Okay. So the purpose of wire gauze, evaporating dish, and Bunsen burner all are being discussed, and I hope you easily understand or tell anybody that how the process of evaporation goes on in your lab. Okay. So in some parts of the world, there is an interesting fact that they obtain salt by evaporating seawater. As you all of you are well familiar that seawater is a salty water. So what happens that what they do, they obtain salt by evaporating the seawater that is trapped in a large shallow salt pans, and the sun's heat gradually evaporates the excess water and leaving behind the salt, and this is then racked up in piles to dry. Okay, so this is also a fact. Yes, that's most of the countries do this just to get the salt from the sea water. Here you can see in a picture the people are doing so. They are evaporating salt, they are evaporating seawater, and they just make a piles of salt over here. So this is a common practice in some countries. So the next technique of separation is sublimation, which is basically a change of a substance from a solid to a vapor without ever becoming a liquid. For example, carbon dioxide, the so-called dry ice. So let me give you a very interesting example. Like if you keep a naphthalene balls exposed to air for some days, it is observed that their size gets reduced after some days. Why this happens? This happens due to the process called sublimation. Whereas you can see that iron and sulfur they do melt when they are heated and then evaporate rapidly if they are kept well below their melting point. So they are also the best example of sublimation. So here is an example to study sublimation process, and you can see here that if we have some impure iodine crystals, as you can see here, if we have some impure iodine crystals and we can place them in an evaporating basin. This is a china dish, which is basically an evaporating dish that is used to evaporate excess liquid and only concentrated solid particles left, solid precipitates. Okay, so a funnel is inverted over the filter paper and crystals, and we have also put a cotton plug at the top of the funnel, and in a china dish is slowly heated using a Bunsen burner. And look what we have observed. The impure iodine crystals on heating gets directly transformed into vapors, and also the vapors gets cooled on the glass surface and converted into solid form. So then we can infer that the impure iodine crystals undergo the process of sublimation, and hence it is converted into vapors formed directly. And you know what happens? That when vapors are allowed to cool directly, it can transform into solid state again. So here is an example of sublimation process, which is using an iodine crystal. So here comes the process of distillation, which is also a filtration technique. So it's a process that is used to separate the solvent from a solution. For example, you have some seawater and you wanted to obtain pure water from it, and you would need to heat the water until it boils, and you would then cool and condense the steam or water vapors produced. Where water is, you know, turned back into a liquid water which is absolutely pure. and that's what we call a distilled water, like boiling water that is now turning into vapors and leaving the salt behind, and it is collected and condensed back into liquid after cooling down, and the liquid we finally get is called distilled water. Okay. Similarly, there are uh, flowers that contain fragrant oils and which are used to make perfume. And what happens? This oil is obtained by heating the flowers and distilling the vapors which come off. In some countries where drinking water is in very short supply, but there are plentiful quantities of oil or other fuels, the drinking water is produced by distilling sea water. Here you can see an apparatus that is used for the process of simple distillation. Here is a Bunsen burner for the purpose to provide heat, and this is a distilling flask that is usually a round bottomed flask, and here it contains a mixture. And when we bring mixture a gentle boil, the vapor starts producing, and the thermometer setting over here, it measures the temperature. Okay. The vapor then condenses into a condenser. From here, the vapors condenses into condenser. Here you can see two. Here's water out and cool water in. This is just to make this condenser um, cool, to avoid the heating up of the condenser. And this is the central hollow section where the vapors will pass and surrounded by another section where cooled water will start entering on the another side, and finally the receiving flask receives a liquid which is called distillate, which is a pure liquid now. So this is the operators that is showing the process of simple distillation, and the important things for these operators are the distilling flask, thermometer, this condenser, Bunsen burner, and flask. If we talk about the oil companies that obtain their oil by drilling wells in the ground or rocks under the sea, you know the oil which comes from the wells is basically a crude oil. So for this purpose we need a fractional distillation. So the fractional distillation is a process of separating mixture of chemical compounds. This means that each part of the mixture can be kept apart from the chemicals, like crude oil, which is a mixture of kerosene, petrol, and other things, and there are hydrocarbons. So we need to separate them according to their each fractions. So for this purpose, we carry out a fractional distillation process. So the crude oil, which is a mixture of different oils like petrol, kerosene, and different hydrocarbons, they cannot be used until they have been separated out at an oil refinery. So what happens at the refinery where the crude oil is first heated in a very big distillation columns, and each part of the mixture boils at different temperatures, and the part with the lowest boiling point boils first, and it is collected from the bottom column, and similarly part of the mixture which has the highest boiling point, it is collected from the top of the column. And this type of distillation in which each fraction is distilling according to their boiling points is called a fractional distillation. And this process is also used to produce a very large quantities of different gases like oxygen, nitrogen, and argon by fractionally distilling liquefied air. Here you can see an oil refinery showing the tall distillation columns. This is what is inside a distillation column. There are different uh, components of the crude oil, petrol, naphtha. They have different boiling points, and this is how they are separating or according to their boiling points, and each fraction is being separated according to their boiling points. So now let's talk about paper chromatography. So it's a very common technique that is widely used for the separation of different pigments. And when more than one solute is dissolved in a solvent, they can be separated using a chromatography. And chromatography works because the dissolved substances, the solutes, have different sized particles and which travel at different speeds across or along filter paper. So this technique is particularly useful in separating different colored chemicals, different pigments, food colorings, and it is also used in different laboratory samples like blood samples, urine samples, and it compares the samples of chlorophyll from different plants. So here are the two main ways of using chromatography. The one way is to cut a wick out of circular filter paper, and the second way is to use rectangle of filter paper. Here you can see a beaker which contains a solvent over which there is a filter paper and a wick is cut out of it. Now what happens when once you cut a wick out of a circular filter paper and then place a dot of ink in the center of the paper, the ink form from the felt tip pens works particularly well. Like if you place your pen over here and just place a dot here, the wick is bent down into a beaker, and you know what happens? This wick that is cut down, you can see it here in the beaker. It just dipped inside a beaker of water or some other solvent. And what happens? You can see here a blue part. Okay, so this is the solvent soaks up the wick into the main part of the filter paper. As it does so, the various dyes in the ink spread out and forming a concentric circles at different colors like this. So now this is a way in which we just cut a wick of filter paper. We just put it back into the beaker and it soaks up the solvent inside a beaker. And after the solvent just start raising, it starts forming a circles of different dyes, and it's showing that this solvent was a mixture of these different dyes or inks. So this is the other way is to use a rectangle of filter paper. So in this experiment, what we do, a pencil line is drawn above 1 centimeter from the bottom. Here you can see a rectangular filter paper. Here is a line which is drawn, and then we put a marks according to our samples. Like if they're showing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it means there are 5 dots. Okay, 5 samples. So now what happens? These are the spores of different inks that are placed along this baseline. The filter paper is then just rolled up and put it in a beaker that is containing a small quantity of solvent. Okay, the solvent seeps up or start absorbing the liquid in a container, and that is carrying the ink dyes within it. Each different dye will form a band. It form a band like this. They will form a band up to a certain point, and you can compare an unknown ink point with the points that are shown here, and then you can find out that which point was not already known. So this is how we can use a rectangle of filter paper for chromatography purpose. And finally, here are the dictation words. So let's revise these words with me. Particles, chlorine, chromium, conductors, argon, aircraft, brittle, equipment, shield, dentistry, fungicides, insecticides, jewelry, explosives, margarine, combustion, oxyacetylene, compound, mixture, substances, acetic acid, additives, concrete, gravel, brass, vital, methane, distillation, filtrate, residue, solute, solvent, funnel, impurities, beaker, and dies. So these are the dictation words, and you need to learn these spellings. Here is the assignment. You need to learn and write these dictation words, and you need to learn and complete the question number 8 and 9 on page number 56, 55 to 56. You will solve these questions on the book. Here are some points that we use to review our lecture. We have just uh, done with it. So, separation techniques are those techniques that can be used to separate different states of matter, such as liquid and solid. So we have discussed different techniques like filtration, which separate the different solid and liquid on the basis of their solubility. We have discussed the evaporation, which is used to separate the solute from the solvent on the basis of like excess liquid evaporates. And we also studied the process of sublimation, distillation, and paper chromatography. Thank you so much. I hope you like the lecture. Bye bye everyone. Allah Hafiz.